Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the RSM. I'm Christopher Woodhouse. This live event is part of our In Conversation series. We started these interviews in 2019 when we were able to hold the events in our London headquarters at number 1 Wimpole Street. With the pandemic, we've been doing all we can to stay in touch and to stay connected with you, our members and supporters, but by Zoom. Those of you who've been with us before will know that we've interviewed key thinkers and leaders in different fields, a wide range of fascinating individuals. And we're certainly continuing in that vein tonight with George Osborne. George, thank you very much for succumbing to your uncle's pressure as our go-between and joining us this evening. Your distinction is such that nothing I could possibly say will add anything to it. In 2 months, you're reaching your half century. In that time, you've achieved more than most people, given even a whole century. You've had 2 careers so far, firstly as a politician and Chancellor of the Exchequer, and secondly as editor of the Evening Standard. And now you're going to start on a third as a banker. There is an exceptionally long Wikipedia entry, and you have to watch that very carefully because it gets updated frequently, twice in the last month actually. So George, welcome.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Christopher, for having me on. And it's a delight to join supporters of the Royal Society.
Thank you. Now, COVID has been very expensive. Are you glad that you're not the Chancellor during the pandemic, or would you have relished the challenge?
Well, I think there's part of any politician, and certainly part of doing those top jobs, you enjoy the big challenge, the big, crisis, frankly, because that's when the states needed most, that's when governments needed most. So, although Rishi Sunak, who I have a very high regard for, will be having a bit of a nightmare over the last year in terms of the workload and the stress and the kind of difficult decisions he's got to make. In the end, this is kind of what the job's there for. This is why we have governments, to protect, to throw a protective arm around us as a country and as a society when things are tough. I mean, the role of government is a bit easier when everything's going well.
Well, where has all this money come from? It's perplexing to those of us who aren't in your sort of realm.
Well, essentially, at the moment, a lot of it is coming from the monetary policy of the Bank of England. Now, back in the old days, you would think like sort of buying up government debt, quantitative easing, kind of in layman's term, printing money was hyperinflationary. It was a sort of thing that kind of Zimbabwe did, or pre-war Germany, Weimar Germany. But it will be in countries which don't have credibility. But because the UK and other countries, big Western democracies, like the Eurozone, like Japan, like the United States, have built up this credibility, they can run these very, very loose monetary policies. And such are the conditions in the world that either the central banks or indeed investors around the world have a kind of big appetite for debt. So essentially, the answer to your question is we're borrowing a lot of it, and the Bank of England is helping us do that. But the only thing is you can never be sure. I mean, one thing COVID teaches us again is life's unpredictable. The world is an unpredictable place, and the mood can change very quickly. And if you read the financial press these days, there's talk of inflation, talk of higher interest rates. So if you're the Chancellor or the Prime Minister, you've always got to be thinking, well, what happens if it suddenly gets a bit more expensive to borrow? What happens if the world becomes a bit more unforgiving towards countries that are borrowing lots of money? That's something I saw when I was in number 11. suddenly we went out of a banking crisis where everyone was saying you should spend lots of money, throw lots of money at the problem, to a recovery where suddenly if you were in Greece or Italy or Spain or Ireland on our doorstep or Portugal, they couldn't borrow anything because no one would lend them any money. And they went, really from kind of feast to famine almost overnight, certainly in sort of economic terms, almost overnight. So the mood can change, and government. One of the kind of jobs of the government is to be alert to that and think ahead to what might happen.
But of course now everybody must be borrowing money.
There's also lots of people with money to lend. Well, one of the kind of challenges at the moment, in fact, if you're running a pension fund or paying people's pensions, many people maybe on this call have received their pensions, or you're running an insurance company and you pay out an insurance premium. One of the challenges at the moment is finding a kind of good return for your money. And that's one of the reasons you get, suddenly people like going into tech stocks or, because they're looking for opportunities that better return than these governments. And, it's really borrowing is like a supply and demand. And one of the reasons why governments like Britain can charge very, very low interest rates and essentially is because there are lots of people who want to lend us money at the moment. But as I say, that can change, that's one of the things that I think, if you listen carefully to what Rishi Sunak was saying in his budget, he was beyond the kind of headline kind of measures. He was basically saying, look, we've got to start talking about getting our house back in order, and we've got to show the world that, we whilst we quite rightly spend a huge amount of money to get through this pandemic, we are going to have to start to fix the roof when the sun starts to shine again. And I think one interesting thing just to reflect on, Christopher, is that really I can't think of any previous moment in our history when we could have spent all this money on a pandemic. I mean, you are obviously an extremely eminent specialist in medicine, and in all previous plagues and pandemics are not new. Thankfully, we haven't experienced one in this country for a long time. But in previous generations, previous centuries, there's no way society could have paid people to stay at home. If you were on the breadline, as most of the population was, you had to go out to work, or else your family would die of starvation, and you would go out with the disease, and whether you had the Black Death or whatever it was, there was no option of the society kind of locking everyone in their homes and paying for everyone to be at home. And it is a kind of measure, I think it's worth just reflecting, it's a measure of how much progress we've made as human beings, and how much richer our countries have become over the centuries, even over the last 100 years, that we've gone through this period, and essentially, certainly in the West, governments have paid populations to stay at home.
So is that why, with the sort of tax raises that we've had in the recent budget, the Conservative Party have actually increased their lead over Labour and it's now about somewhere between 13 and 17%. Is that the country?
Oh, well, it depends how long we've got on this. That is a very big question. I think there's some recent, clearly the success of the vaccination program is very evident. And although I'm was passionately in favour of Britain staying in the European Union, unfortunately our neighbours in Europe have made such a mess of it that it's sort of demonstrated that it's not straightforward to run these vaccination programs. So it is a clear success of the government, the NHS, the teams at the Department of Health and elsewhere across Whitehall. It's clearly a success for the government and all who work for the state. And so the people in charge are kind of being rewarded politically in the opinion polls. I think there's a kind of broader question about, without going into, maybe we'll come on to this later, the Labour Party and what is it saying at the moment? I'm not sure. And I think Keir Starmer, in many ways looks like someone who could be the Prime Minister, unlike the previous candidate they offered up at the last two general elections, Jeremy Corbyn. But Keir Starmer looks like he could be the Prime Minister. He's got a very distinguished career and was, of course, our Director of Public Prosecution. But if you ask yourself, what is the Labour Party actually saying at the moment? What is their economic policy? Do they want to spend more, spend less? What do they want to do with our schools? What do they want to do with our NHS? What do they want to do with our defence? There's just not very much there. And I spent a lot of my political career in opposition, actually. I mean, you kindly introduced me as someone who'd been Chancellor, but I was the shadow Chancellor for longer than almost anyone in British history. Not a job, by the way, you want to do for like a long time. You're trying to do the real job. But I went through a long time in opposition, and opposition is very easy to. You every day you react to events and you say, oh, the nurses should be paid more, or businesses shouldn't be taxed more, but that's not really your job. That's part of the job. The real job of the opposition is to create an alternative government and an alternative argument. And at the moment, and this is not, I'm really not trying to make a partisan point here, because there's many things the Conservatives have done which I don't really support or approve, but the Labour Party just has nothing to say. And successful oppositions do make an argument. David Cameron in opposition made an argument about the kind of society he wanted the country to be. Tony Blair in opposition, Margaret Thatcher in opposition. Those are the last three people who turned the opposition job into the Prime Minister job. And that. So sorry, we're diverting into politics, but I think, to answer your polling question, it's pretty amazing. We're in the 11th year of a Tory Prime Minister. There've been 4 general elections, and the Labour Party has lost them all, and at this rate is on course to lose the 5th general election, which will be the first time in my lifetime that's happened.
Let's move on to your second career, if we may. You left Oxford with the intention of becoming a journalist, and the Times clearly made a big mistake in not appointing you. In your Spectator diary last month, I think it was, you described journalism as a lifelong interest. So how has that shaped your life, and what made you change to politics?
When I was at Oxford University, I was reading history, and but my kind of great passion at university was student journalism, and I was the editor of something called ISIS magazine, which is an unfortunate name now. I've always been expected to be stopped at the kind of US border, having worked for ISIS. But ISIS magazine, and then I wanted, when I left university, to go into journalism. I actually left in a recession in the early 90s, and there were not many journalist jobs going, and I wasn't really good enough to get one. And I had an interest in current affairs. I had an interest in politics. I wasn't a member of the Conservative Party, but I had voted Conservative in the recent general election. And a friend of mine said, "There's a job going at Conservative HQ. Come and work there." And the rest is political history, as they say. Yes.
You told me earlier that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is also the Treasurer of the Royal Household, which is very interesting. I hadn't known that. What has that given you any special insight into the relationship between the Sussexes and the press and TV interviewers?
Well, I think no, one of the interesting features of being the Chancellor of the Exchequer is it's very much, not central to the job, but you are in charge of the royal finances with the royal family, with the Queen and Buckingham Palace. And there are 3 treasurers of the royal household. There's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Prime Minister, who basically delegates it to the Chancellor, and the Keeper of the Privy Purse, who is someone appointed by the Queen to look after the Queen's finances. Usually a partner in an accountancy firm, and yes, dealing with the royal finances. I actually changed quite dramatically the royal finances. They'd been a civil list since 1760, since George III, when the monarch had handed over all their estates at the beginning of a parliament in return for an annual sum. And this system basically was bust by the time I arrived. And Alistair Darling, who I had a very good relationship with, my predecessor as Chancellor, I remember him saying to me as he was sort of handing over power, he said, look, I'm afraid the royal finances are going to need fixing. I didn't really get round to it because I had the banking crash. And so we introduced something called the sovereign grant, and that gave me quite a exposure to the royal family and our incredible monarch. As a newspaper editor, of course, you're dealing with these stories all the time, and I found that one of the kind of interesting features of the job. And there's quite a lot of gossip coming into newspaper editors and reporters and the royal correspondents from different parts of the royal family. I mean, it's not all completely made up in the press, although some of it is. They are being kind of tipped off by things, and there are different households and so on. And I think what was interesting, I won't get into the kind of who's right and who's wrong, and with Harry and Meghan and the royal family. I mean, except to say, I do think that the Queen has done an incredible job for us all. What I would say, however, is that they'll kind of I can understand why that Harry and Meghan didn't want to kind of deal with the royal lobby correspondence, and it was, that they because they essentially had a lot of power in the age of social media and through their kind of connections in the United States, to have a bigger platform and a bigger voice than just in the UK. And so it's sort of, it's very sad what's happening, frankly, for the family and for the institution. But it's one of the things that social media has done, is just completely disrupted the kind of power hierarchy that we used to have over information. A newspaper edit, the only way you could really find things out in our society was either by word of mouth, or a newspaper editor would decide to put them in the newspaper, or someone would say something in Parliament, or the producer of the 10 o'clock BBC News would put it on. The information was controlled by quite a small number of people. And now anyone with a Twitter account can reach a load of, millions and millions of people. And that has really disrupted our politics, not just here, but around the world. Donald Trump essentially got elected on the back of his Twitter account. And it has, I think, changed the way the royal family interact with the public. And it's given, certainly in this case, it's created an asymmetry where the Duke and Duchess of Sussex can reach very large numbers of people, and in this case also through kind of going to the United States and doing a TV interview in the United States that their predecessors probably wouldn't have been able to do. That's
very interesting, because what is going to be the future then of serious and largely truthful journalism? I mean, we've got the Evening Standard, which is free on paper. We've got news on the web, which is largely free for the moment. We've got fake news on the web, which is very free. Yeah. So what is the future of serious journalism?
Well, that's a very good question. I think at the kind of top end of the market, what we would call the broadsheet end of the market, there is a model that exists, which is a subscription model. So, I'm sure people listening to this will have their Times newspaper subscription or their FT subscription, let's say. And that has proved to be a successful model. So people will pay. That money is used to employ journalists and photographers and sub-editors and so on, and indeed return a profit to the business. And that works. What I would, however, caution about is that the number of those readers is relatively small. The kind of real challenge is the much larger circulation newspapers, the tabloids, the kind of the Sun, the Daily Mail, the Evening Standard, to give you that example. We were producing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies of the newspaper every day, many, many more than the FT. And the subscription model there is proving much more challenging. No one has really cracked it, because people are not prepared to pay subscriptions. Well, they certainly haven't yet been able no one's yet been able to crack this model of paying subscriptions for the mass market newspapers. And that is a real challenge, because whatever you think of them, they did have editorial control. There is usually an attempt, certainly in the Evening Standard, to deliver very serious journalism. And you've got to pay for these things. And so the Evening Standard, in the end, started handing itself out for free and operating off the advertising that it was able to attract. But that's an expensive product to produce. You've got to hire journalists, you've got to print the thing you've got to buy the newsprint, you've got to print it, and then you've got to distribute it around London. And we're giving it away for free. So no one has yet cracked the kind of mass market journalist model, to my knowledge. And even some of these sort of internet businesses that emerged, the kind of BuzzFeeds and Huffington Post and so on, they too have been economically challenged as well. They haven't become the kind of biggest and richest internet companies. So there is a real problem for the kind of journalism that most of the population consume, as opposed to the, as I say, more elite broadsheets. There is not yet a sustainable model. There is a lot of money out there, because Facebook and Google, two companies you've heard of, I'm sure, and some of the largest and most profitable companies in the world, make their money out of digital advertising, and so there is a lot of money out there. People are, it's just we haven't found a way to make sure that money reaches the serious journalistic endeavors. And there's lots of interesting experiments and developments. If people have been following, for example, in Australia now, there's a new law that forces Facebook and Google to pay for the journalism that you can see on their sites. So I think things will change, but it has been a really challenging 15 years or so for the newspaper industry. And it's worth remembering, Chris, that these businesses were, back in the day, some of the richest businesses in Britain. We saw the richest people in Britain owning them, but they became rich on the back of their newspapers, not were rich and then bought a newspaper. And so it's a big challenge that no one has yet cracked, and it matters to our society, because you don't get you just don't have that informed journalism, which is expensive to do. You have to pay good people to go and investigate stories, and and I think, as you quite rightly said in your intro, we've sort of taken it for granted. We get that largely for free.
But if it's going to come from Google and other things online, how are they going to be controlled, or how are they going to control in the way that you as an editor would control the news?
Well, first of all, it's an interesting development. I mean, in many ways, fake news has forced these companies to start thinking more about what they allow on their platforms. And when, for example, you get conspiracy theories about vaccines, they now work hard to kind of take that stuff off their sites. So they are being pushed into a kind of editorial role, although they always claim they're not editors. They're platforms for anyone to put their material on and people to see it. I think if you took a kind of longer view of this, in the history of monopolies and the history of utilities, what has happened is someone has emerged and invented the railway engine, right? Or laid all the railway track in the country, or developed the light bulb and electricity, right? And these people like Rockefeller and Getty, they become unbelievably rich. They were the kind of Mark Zuckerbergs of their day. And then over time, they get more and more regulated, because they come to be seen as a sort of public utility. Their returns are controlled by the government. If there's monopolies, they're broken up. And this has happened, in the United States as well as in Europe and in the UK. And so I wouldn't be surprised, over a period of time, if the things like searching the internet or social media platforms become like the kind of telephone system or the electricity company. Still private, still profitable for investors, but nevertheless not, much more regulated and much more controlled, and probably more plural, more of them. So that's, history would suggest that's where they're going to end up.
You're comparing them to Standard Oil and Bell Telephone from the past. Is that right? That the government will break them up?
I think over time. I mean, I don't think it will be here in the UK. But I mean, you know, we won't perhaps talk too much about Brexit tonight, but we spent 5 years talking about it. But you know, I think in fact, if any, you know, the European Commission, the European market is big enough, and therefore the European Commission is powerful enough to act in this space. And in fact, it's one of those areas where the European Union doesn't need the kind of consent of its member states. The European Competition Authority is incredibly powerful and sort of acts unilaterally. But there's also talk in the United States of that. I just think in the United States, the politics there is so messy that it's kind of hard to see that you could sustain a majority for a really, really dramatic change in the way they're regulated. But who knows, there's quite a kind of confluence on the left and the right that this is going to happen.
Brexit's been rather driven off the headlines by COVID. I think some of us are relieved by that. But what about referenda? We had none before 1975, and there've been 11 in my lifetime, and there were 5 in your sort of political span. Some countries have them and some countries don't. What lessons have you learned from the referenda that you've experienced?
Well, probably don't have them. It's the short lesson. You know, I was not, I mean, this has only emerged since I left government and since the Cameron government fell. You know, I was not in favour of having a referendum on our membership of the EU. But it was a collective decision, and the people I, you know, liked then and like now wanted to do it. I had the chance to make my argument in private, but you know, I was outvoted, overruled, perfectly understandably. I was not the Prime Minister. You know, I find referendums, they're just, you know, it's very hard to kind of get the argument on the issue. And inevitably kind of complex issues are reduced to a kind of yes and a no. On the other, there are cases, I mean, I think, you know, it'd be hard to kind of imagine a country like Scotland becoming independent without there having been a referendum. So I think there is I wouldn't say kind of never have referendums, and there isn't a role for a referendum. But I certainly think you should be cautious about going down that path. And we do live in a parliamentary democracy. We live in a democracy where, you know, we elect people to try and make these decisions on our behalf. So you know, broadly speaking, I'm not a massive fan of them.
Well, do you think, I mean, assuming one is going to have a referendum, do you think that it's reasonable for what is really a very, very major decision to be made on the basis of a simple majority, which theoretically could be a majority of one? Should there not be some structure to control that?
I think, I mean, we had that in the 1970s in the Scottish, the referendum on Scotland in the late 1970s. I think, you know, you had a higher bar, which wasn't passed. I think to be in practice, if more than 50% of people had voted to leave the EU, but we had a rule that said 60% had to vote, that would have been untenable. You know, more than half the population wanted to leave, and we would have left, in my view, anyway. So, you know, in a democracy, 50+1 is, you know, is usually more than enough. And of course, you know, regularly governments are elected with 40% of the vote, you know, if they're lucky. So I'm not such a kind of, I'm not a great believer that you can kind of make the referendum better by putting in kind of additional hurdles, to be honest. I think what is broadly true, but, you know, this is from my own experience. In the case of Scottish independence, which was the referendum which we called. And there had been an SNP government elected in Holyrood with a majority in the parliament on a mandate to have a an independence referendum. And it would have been very, very hard for the UK to refuse that, I think. I think the UK is perfectly within its rights to refuse it now because we've had a referendum. You can't just kind of constantly revisit the subject. It was a once in a generation decision. But back then, this was, the SNP had a majority in Scotland, and we held the referendum. But there was a very long run into that referendum. There was like a year and a half to 2 years of making the arguments, lots of questions about, which I was involved in, about what the currency would be in Scotland and what the finances would look like and so on. I think in the case of the EU referendum, and of course I share my responsibility for this as someone involved in the campaign, although we knew we were having a referendum for a long time, it was about a 3-year gap between David Cameron announcing it and it actually happening. The argument for membership of the EU was only made in the last couple of months. Until that point, the people who were in favour of remaining in the EU were never really making that argument. And if for those who kind of follow the history of this, in fact, sort of the government was arguing for a better deal in Europe and renegotiation and so on. So the whole sort of British system and all the political parties, not just the Conservatives, although it was of course a Conservative government, had not really bothered to make the argument for being in the EU for many, many a year, and indeed had tended to blame Brussels when things went wrong, often when it was not really their fault or not connected to them. So I think one of the challenges with that referendum was that people had not been asked to really think about the merits of being in the EU until right at the end. But look, we lost, and I'm not with a high turnout. So I think there was a sort of collective failure, myself included, by those who supported our membership of the EU to make the point.
Plenty of questions coming in, George. Here's a very interesting one from Jude D'Alessio, and something that I've always found very intriguing about the coalition and how it was formed, and the overall state of the economy at that time. There was this famous letter from Liam Byrne, the previous Secretary of the Treasury, saying that the coffers were empty. What do you think would have happened if the coalition hadn't been formed?
I mean, we've been through a recent period of genuine political instability. The May government, the hung parliament, you remember all those, the inability to come to a conclusion on Brexit for several years. That created a lot of instability political instability in the UK, and essentially sort of paralysis in the system until it was resolved by the Conservatives winning a majority in December 2019. If that had all happened back in 2010, when we had a result which also could have led to kind of minority governments with no majority, chancellors of the Exchequer who couldn't get their budgets through Parliament and so on. I think that would have been quite dangerous for the UK, because at that point, back in 2010, which was not the case in 2017, 2018, where we really it was a self-inflicted problem we had. Back in 2010, we were in the middle of we were still going through a financial crisis, and lots of our near neighbours were falling over, like Ireland, like Italy, like Spain. And I think then if you'd had a situation where you had a very high budget deficit, you had a parliament that was hung, you had probably a minority Conservative government unable to do anything, Britain would not been in great shape. And it was very much to the kind of credit, I think, of the political leadership at the time, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, thinking really sort of outside the political box and saying, why don't we form a coalition? No one was predicting it. No one was anticipating it. Everyone thought there might be some sort of what's called supply and confidence arrangement, which probably wouldn't have lasted. But I remember talking to David just about 2 weeks before the general election, when everyone was still expecting there to be a Conservative majority, but we were getting nervous. And he said, look, why don't you go away with William Hague, with Oliver Letwin, my colleagues at the time, and think about what a coalition might look like and what we could offer the Liberal Democrats. And it's interesting reading all the accounts subsequently at that time. particularly from the Liberal Democrats themselves, they were rather kind of, what they say is that the Labour leadership, Gordon Brown and co, were rather sort of offhand with the Liberal Democrats and rather dismissive. And whereas they just like the fact that we Conservatives have bothered to read their manifesto and we're trying to find areas of common ground. And certainly working in that government for 5 years, again, at the time, people thought it would only last 5 months or if that. But working in that government for 5 years was incredibly functional and rational, and decisions were made, in the way I think people would hope governments make decisions. They had to be, because you couldn't really have little cabals. You had to get two quite different political parties to agree to anything before it happened. So there had to be a sort of degree of common sense and commonality. And some of the kind of wilder things the Conservatives wanted to do were never going to happen, and some of the wilder things the Liberal Democrats wanted to do weren't going to happen. So it was an absolute pleasure to work in that government, and was actually much less kind of divisive than sometimes working in single party governments can be, where the factions or the dividing lines aren't as clear, and so therefore can be a bit more vicious.
Inevitably, there have been some questions about austerity. There were committees looking at protection from future pandemics or other disasters. Were they abandoned because of austerity, or did austerity limit what we've been able to do in the pandemic?
Well, I don't believe so. In fact, I believe the opposite, which is precisely because we fixed the public finances, we didn't go into this crisis in a mess, in which case we wouldn't have been able to afford all the things we've done. And I would sort of make I'd make 2 points about austerity. First of all, every single Western country underwent a period of retrenchment and cutting spending and increasing taxes during that period. And most of those countries did it much more severely than we did. And yet we had strong growth and very, very low unemployment, when everyone expected unemployment to go up. So we kept people in work. And the second thing is that, everyone says, like, we don't want any more austerity ever again. It's a function of crises. When you spend large sums of money, way beyond what the country can normally afford, and your country is poorer, sadly, as a result of the crisis, that you are going to have to cut your cloth accordingly. And you don't have to call it austerity, you can call it whatever you like. But if you look at what is happening here, you've got a Chancellor Exchequer restricting public sector pay rises, freezing public sector pay, increasing NHS pay only by 1%, increasing business tax by 25%, cutting the foreign aid budget. Those are the decisions that happen after big crises where a lot of money is spent. And it looks quite similar to the set of decisions that in a coalition government I had to take as well, with the support of the coalition. And as I say, very similar to the decisions that were taken in Europe and indeed in the United States as well. Now, as for sort of pandemic preparedness, well, look, there's obviously going to be lots of investigations into this. I would say the kind of interesting question is this. Every time we did a risk assessment across government of what's the biggest threat to the UK, apart from nuclear war, a pandemic flu was number one. And we had endless discussions about what to do about it. And so the whole system knew that a pandemic was a possibility, but it seems to me that we were looking in the wrong space. We were looking at flu rather than coronavirus. And unlike countries in Asia, which had been through SARS and been through MERS, the Middle Eastern version, there was no sort of general recent experience of a coronavirus-like pandemic. And so no country in the West was well prepared. What contingency plans had been put in place, which were really to surge hospital capacity and surge ICU capacity, and that did get put into place. Hence, those Nightingale hospitals weren't just sort of dreamt up on the spot. There've been many, many years in the planning. But what no one had planned for was the amount of PPE equipment you'd need, the level of the quarantines you'd require, what to do in the care homes, and so on. And what is striking is that almost every country in the West, not the East, has experienced these similar kind of issues. Those following American politics at the moment will notice that the New York governor, Cuomo, who was a kind of hero last year, is in quite a lot of political trouble, mainly because of allegations of sexual misconduct. But these all were triggered by an investigation into what happened into New York City care homes last year. So I think there's a kind of danger of sort of British exceptionalism that we sort of think, these were only problems that happened to us. I would, if I was doing an inquiry, I would now look very closely at one counterexample, which is Germany. Germany did seem to handle the first year of the crisis better than we did, much better than we did, better than France did, better than Spain did, better than the United States did. And I've not really seen a kind of convincing explanation of why that's the case, and I'd love to see why that is. And maybe it's because the health service there is more regional, and there was more involvement of regional government and so on. That's the best explanation I've heard. But that's a kind of question that needs to be answered going forward. And I honestly don't think it's, if there had been more money in the NHS a year ago, and by the way, we did throughout that whole period increase real funding on the NHS. It was the one budget we kept increasing. But even if there had been even more money in the NHS, I just don't believe that would have dramatically changed the outcome of the pandemic, because it didn't change the outcome of the pandemic in very similar countries which did have higher health budgets.
Thank you very much. Well, let's turn to another of your great interests, modern history, because that's what you told us you read at Oxford, and Wikipedia tells me that you got a 2-1. Not a typical subject for a political career. We're often told that there are no great statesmen nowadays, in the broadest sense of the word. So who would you nominate as great statesmen or stateswomen, let's say, in the 20th century? We better leave Churchill out, because that's probably a bit too easy.
Well, you are partly made by your events. The leaders of the countries that got through the Second World War on the Allied side were seen as great statesmen because they had dramatic events to deal with. And I think before we pass over Churchill, I think Churchill's claim to great statesmanship is not just his sort of longevity in office and the fact he was warning about the Nazis beforehand, but there is a very particular moment in the spring of 1940. And this didn't emerge until the 1970s, many decades after the Second World War. It's never mentioned in Churchill's memoirs. But the War Cabinet, which was basically Churchill, Attlee, Halifax, Chamberlain, and a couple of others, they did discuss surrendering to Hitler. And we never knew that. It's so not part of our national story that we stood alone, we never contemplated surrender. Well, they did discuss it in May 1940. And in an extraordinary period, and this has now been written about, and there's been very good play about it as well, some people might have seen. During that period, basically Churchill, with the help of Attlee and the Labour Party, stood his ground and said, we are not contemplating surrender. And I think there are many other people in that job, including actually other candidates like Chamberlain and Halifax, who were the other likely people who could have been Prime Minister at that point, who would have started the discussion of a peace or some form of surrender with Germany. So that, that is Churchill's big claim, that he made a massive difference. Now, as for other people, well, you have to look back at the kind of really, the prime ministers. It's usually prime ministers. There are a couple of chancellors in that mix who kind of changed the shape of the state, I guess. And David Lloyd George is a great example. More famous really for being chancellor than prime minister, although he was prime minister during the First World War. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, and I always find it's kind of, obviously still such a sort of love-hate figure in our society, and people on this call probably groaning when she's mentioned. I'll tell you something interesting from my political career. When she died, it just was assumed she would have a state funeral. And we hadn't had a state funeral since Winston Churchill. And I think before that, when like William Gladstone had been the previous one. But there was no real debate. There was no like, is this really the kind of honor we should give her? And she got a burial unlike any of the other prime ministers get. Normally prime ministers just buried in their kind of local village church or wherever they, come from. But she got the full St. Paul's Cathedral treatment. And I remember sitting there, and I was sitting in front, behind all the kind of living other prime ministers, sitting in the row in front of me. And I remember thinking, they're all sitting there thinking, I'm not going to get this when I die. and so, she gets her claim because she did, essentially most of my political life, and certainly most of my, has been in the kind of shadow of Margaret Thatcher. It's still, so she's like a very, very big figure and one of our top prime ministers. So yeah, so those are kind of big figures, but that, you don't have to be kind of a leading, you don't have to be the head of your country, leader or head of your government to make, great political change. And you look at the kind of Martin Luther Kings of this world, or the Mahatma Gandhis, even greater. I mean, Martin Luther King has probably had a bigger influence on the United States than any president since Roosevelt. And he's got a day named after him. And I don't know, as far as I know, he never held any political office. So
it's very interesting that you seldom meet anyone who admits to having voted for Mrs. Thatcher, and yet she still won 3 elections. So there must be some people concealing that.
Well, there's also, I'd say this, Christopher, which was almost the first person that both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown invited round to Downing Street when they became Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher, despite the fact they were Labour politicians who had kind of grown up as part of the Labour opposition at the time. And so she's still the only person in Downing Street with a room, there's the Margaret Thatcher room, and she's the only person in Downing Street with the only modern Prime Minister with a portrait of hers. So if you go into Downing Street, there are photographs on that staircase of all the Prime Ministers people will be familiar with. And there are 1 or 2 portraits of Pitt the Younger and so on. But the only person that there's a kind of modern portrait of is Margaret Thatcher. This is not, I didn't, by the way, mean this to be a kind of great paean of praise to her. And I think there's lots of, legitimate debate about how she went about things. But the fact she was transformational is undoubted.
You really went in your political career from being a backbench MP to being in the shadow cabinet, and then later on Chancellor. Is that a good thing, or should there be a training scheme for politicians? Or, I mean, sometimes it's said they should have jobs in the real world before they go into Parliament. And of course, there are good examples and bad examples of both of those, aren't there? Well, what's your view?
Well, in fact, some of those, the great political statesmen of our past will go into Parliament when they're 25, 26, younger. So I think a Parliament should be representative of a broader, the different ages of our society. I don't think it should all be kind of, seniors. You need a variety of opinions and backgrounds there. I think one thing I would say is that it's not really surprising that almost everyone who gets to the top of politics, there are exceptions, but almost everyone who gets there has been doing it for a very long time as a professional politician, essentially. I know it's got a very sort of bad kind of connotation, but it's not surprising Tony Blair's the youngest Labour MP, Margaret Thatcher's the youngest woman MP and youngest Conservative MP when she's elected, and John Major was the youngest MP. Boris Johnson has been in public life for a very long time. It's because like any profession, you get better at it the longer you're at it, and all the skills you need of handling complex situations, political situations, handling the media, working with your colleagues in an environment where you can't order people around, you have to take people with you. You know, all of that, the longer you have experience of it, the better. And it tends to be the case that if you're younger, you have more chance to kind of ride out the ups and downs of the political cycle, which might have nothing to do with you, right? So, you know, as I say, the first 9 years of my career in Parliament, I was in opposition. But because I was young, I could sort of ride that period out. You know, as I say, I think it's a kind of rather old-fashioned sort of Athenian idea that the kind of good men and women of the country come together, having you know, done whatever they've done in their lives, to sort of into the People's Assembly to make it. But you know, modern politics, modern government is just vastly more complex than that, and it tends to be. You know, there are exceptions, but tends to be professional people who really set their heart on succeeding in the political world, who get to the top, as it is the case in lots of other professions.
There's a question from Dr. Deet Sarar. I hope I pronounced that properly. Do you think that there is an element of institutional racism in the way that government is constructed?
I think it's certainly the case that there is institutional discrimination in elements of the British state that have been tackled over time but need more work. So I remember there was something called the Macpherson report into the police back in the 1990s, and I think it was driven by the handling of the terrible murder of Stephen Lawrence. And Lord Macpherson, the judge, came up with a conclusion that the police were institutionally racist. And at the time, there was a huge amount of pushback, and a lot of people say that's ridiculous, and how can you call the whole police service racist and so on. And he wasn't saying that all the officers are racist. He says there was just a prejudice in the way that crimes against certain people in the community were handled. And a huge amount of work has been done in the Metropolitan Police to change that. And look how, I think, in my view at least, the Metropolitan Police is vastly better at these issues than a lot of the American police forces are. Because they took a long, hard look at it themselves. And I think a similar kind of approach in other areas of the British state is worth taking. It won't necessarily be discrimination on the basis of race, and it could be on the basis of gender. It could be on the basis of background and education, or location in the country that you come from, and you know, your accent and things like that. There are lots of things. There are, you know, I'm a sort of progressive who thinks you do have to constantly challenge those things. And I remember, you know, it may seem like a small issue, but when I was in government, you know, it didn't sort of cross anyone's mind that decisions had been taken that meant there were no, you know, prominent women on our banknotes suddenly. I mean, there was always the Queen on one side, but, you know, a decision had been taken to replace, you know, I think it was like Elizabeth Fry with Winston Churchill on the 5 banknote. And suddenly there were no women on the banknotes, and no one had kind of called that out. No one in the room had thought that that was a strange thing. But, and indeed, of course, we've never had yet a person from you know, BAME background on one of our banknotes. And those sorts of things, I can imagine a kind of groupthink in the committee that just says, yeah, of course it should be Winston Churchill. But you know, that it's a small example of something I came across, and you know, we did rectify it, and we got Jane Austen onto the £10 note, I think it was. But you know, it was just sort of striking that no one had called it out, and that would be a kind of example of a sort of institutional prejudice that very good, well-minded people involved in the system would never dream that they had.
There's certainly no shortage of things about which to have prejudice, that's for sure. George, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a wonderful pleasure talking. I think we've covered quite a lot of material which reflects your very broad interests and the amount you've done in your career. And it's been a wonderful privilege to be the person to talk to you. I should have perhaps taken some lessons from Paxman. Ladies and gentlemen, you haven't been charged for this evening's webinar, Instead, and if you wish, we're inviting you to support the RSM in these unprecedented times, so that we can support others. There are apparently 1,200 of you out there registered for this webinar. And please remember that the RSM is a charity, and it's only by educating our doctors and helping them to innovate in the practice of medicine that we can prepare them and thus the country perhaps to avoid the next health crisis. If you'd like to make a donation to support this vital work, please go to our website or use the QR on the screen. And we thank you for your generosity, and we thank you for being a part of the conversation series. George.
Well, I would just add, first of all, Christopher, you're much better than Jeremy Paxman, and I've been interviewed by both. Second, there's no such thing as a free lunch or a free webinar, and I've been very happy to take part in it. But I would expect you, I hope, if you've enjoyed it, in return, to give to this excellent Royal Society of Medicine and support the brilliant work that they do. Cough up.
Cough up. Thank you. Thank you very much, George.